everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mar, and for this week's video I decided that I would share some of my favorite books with you that are either Asian inspired, have Asian representation, or are written by Asian authors, because it is May and this month it is AAPI month, or Asian American Pacific Islander month, or Asian Heritage Month, however you want to call it. This month we are celebrating Asian voices. I thought I would give some reading recommendations to those of you who are looking to add more Asian authors to your TBRs. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started with this video. I'm going to try to categorize these books and all of that into like their different genres and all that, but it might be in a little bit of a random order. Also, to give a disclaimer, a lot of the reading recommendations that I'm going to be putting in this video are of East Asian authors and all of that, mostly because first off, I'm East Asian, so all over the years I've been trying to find a lot of books that I feel like have represented me and my culture. I'm trying my best to read more books that are written by Southeast Asian authors and all of that, because Asia is a very big continent. For this one, it's mostly going to be East Asian authors. If you have any recommendations for me and you know what I could add to my TBR, please leave them in the comments below. The first category we're going to be talking about is adult fantasy. The first series I have in the adult fantasy category is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. So I only have the first two books right now, but it's a trilogy. So there's Jade City, there's Jade War, and then there's Jade Legacy. And pretty much this whole series is about these different sort of clans that are living on this island that is very sort of similar to like Hong Kong and all of that. And pretty much on this island, one of the resources of where people like get these special powers is through jade. This story is told through the perspectives of a lot of different characters, but mainly this one family called the Kau family, and pretty much they're the most powerful family, like clans on this island. So they're sort of the ones in charge of how Jade is operated and run, and sort of just the different power dynamics on this island. I took it upon myself to annotate literally everything in this book, and I had such a fun time reading it, and I grew so close to a lot of the characters. So I highly recommend this book series for those of you who want something that, you know, is definitely inspired by a lot of like Hong Kong, like gangster, like movies and dramas and all of that. So I'm in the middle of Jade War right now. I tried annotating Jade War, but it just like, it got to the point where I was like reading this book so slowly. I took a break from it, but I do want to pick this back up. The next recommendation I have is the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. You've probably have heard R.F. Kuang's name probably anywhere you go now, because R.F. Kuang is one of like the most popular authors right now, especially when it comes to Asian inspired fantasy novels and all that. This series literally broke me when I was reading. It's sort of, it goes into like historical fiction, fantasy type of genre, but pretty much it's about this orphan named Rin who wants to escape sort of the situation she's living in. So she applies to this academic military school in this place called Nikon. This is more of a historical fiction fantasy novel that it's very much inspired by the Sino-Japanese War. Yeah, it's the second Sino-Japanese War. War is definitely one of like the main themes in this book. I highly recommend you read this series because it's really good and it's very well written. To continue talking about my love for R.F. Kuang, she has two standalone novels as of right now. So the first one is Babel, or Babel, however you want to call it. And this one is pretty much about the act of translation. It's about this orphan named Robin was from China, but then he's taken to London by this like old, weird, like sort of mysterious British guy and is taught how to translate and all that things from Mandarin into English, English to Mandarin, etc. And he is then enrolled in Oxford University, and there's like a fantasy element to this as well, and it has a lot of like quotes about just like the act of translation and all that, and how like through different translations, some things lose their meaning and all that. And it's a very like interesting take on, sort of the act of translating. I would say this is like fantasy, but it's also dark academia as well because it takes place in an academic setting. I feel like everyone raves about it online and all of that, so I'm not going to repeat everything that everyone else has said, but I enjoyed reading this book a lot. And then the other standalone book R.F. Kuang has is Yellowface. So this one is very different from the fantasy type of books she previously released. So I think that's why a lot of people were kind of like taken aback when it was first released. But pretty much this book is about this girl named June who steals the manuscript from this Asian author named Athena Liu after Athena tragically, dies. And so June is trying to take credit for this book that Athena wrote after she steals her manuscript and all that. And it's very interesting. I think a lot of the situations that have been coming up in the book community in general, they're not necessarily loosely based off of this book, but there are a lot of similarities and all of that. But Yellowface, the main character, is absolutely unhinged, and personally to me, I really liked it. Other people have other opinions, which are very valid, but for me, I really like Yellowface. So yeah, this is another recommendation I have. Those are my adult fantasy recommendations. So now let's get into young adult, sort of middle grade fantasy recommendations. This next series, I would say, is probably more middle grade, but it is the Gifted Clan series by Gracie Kim. And pretty much it is by the company Rick Riordan Presents. So it's pretty much Rick Riordan. He finds all of these authors, mostly authors of color, and he helps them, publish their own novels and all of that. If you're a fan of the Percy Jackson books, I love Percy Jackson and all that. So if you're a fan of the Percy Jackson books and you want an Asian sort of inspired version of it, highly recommend The Last Fallen Star. The Last Fallen Star is about this Korean American girl named Riley O who becomes adopted. A lot of these books are about orphans or adoptees and all that from what I've been like sharing and recommending, so I don't know what that says about me. This Korean American girl named Riley O, and when she was young, her parents died, and so she was adopted into this other Korean family. And it turns out that all of these Korean families like come from these Korean witch clans, and so Riley is adopted into this Korean witch family. She has a sister and all of that in this family, and so her sister is a witch and has all these magical powers. Meanwhile, Riley doesn't. Even though her parents were witches and all that, her powers never came to fruition and all of that. And pretty much something happens with Riley's sister, and now Riley has to go on this adventure to save her sister and all that. Like, that's sort of the gist of the first novel and all that. I don't want to spoil anything like that, but The Last Fallen Star, for those of you who are fans of Percy Jackson and all that, I think you would definitely enjoy this book. It's about Korean mythology. Highly recommend. The next young adult fantasy book recommendation I have is the Six Crimson Cranes series by Elizabeth Lim. This series is a duology, and then I believe there's another spin-off novel called Her Radiant Curse, which she just released within the past year or so. But pretty much this book series is about this princess named Shiori Amna, and she lives in this country called Kiata, and pretty much on her 16th birthday, her dad tries to marry her off to another prince of another country, and this girl is not having it, so she makes a couple mistakes, which ends up leading her to get banished from her country because from her stepmother, and also her brothers get turned into cranes, and so she goes on this adventure to fix sort of what happened to her and her brothers and all that. So yeah, you're in for a wild ride. Highly recommend. So now we are moving on from the sort of fantasy book series, and now we are moving on to, I don't even know how to categorize this book series. I would say science fiction-ish, cyberpunk, utopian, action adventure. Sure, let's go with that. But the next book series I have is the Warcross series by Marie Lu. I know Marie Lu has other series. I know she wrote the Legend series. I never read the Legend series, but I have read the Warcross series. So pretty much Warcross is pretty much set in this future where everyone has this device called a Neuralink, not the Elon Musk kind, but pretty much it's like they're like Google glasses, or like the new Apple ones, the Apple goggles or whatever. What are they called? The Apple Vision Pro, like kind of those devices where, everyone sort of has them. And on these devices, there's this game called Warcross. And Warcross, I would say, is like, it's a mix of different games. Fortnite, World of Warcraft, like those kind of games. So pretty much when they put on the Neuralink, they're instantly transported into the game and they're physically playing the game. This book is pretty much about this 18-year-old girl named Amika Chen, who pretty much she accidentally hacks into one of the Warcross championships, and that pretty much gets the attention of the CEO of the company of the Neuralink and Warcross and all that, and he pretty much hires her to be sort of his little like spy and all of that in the Warcross championships, because he believes that someone in the championships or someone is working to sort of hack into his, his technology and all that, because some weird things are happening, and because Amika is so smart and no one would, kind of question her, she kind of takes on this ability as like this sort of bounty hunter, and if she succeeds with this task, of finding who the mole is, she could get a lot of money and all that. There's some mystery to it. There's a lot of questions that come up and plot twists and all that. So this is one of my favorite book series, so I highly recommend you read Warcross by Marie Lu. So now we're moving on to sort of the more romantasy type of books now. The next book I have is Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. One thing about me is I am Chloe Gong's #1 fan. If Chloe Gong has one fan, it is me. If Chloe Gong has no fans, I am dead, okay? Immortal Longings is her adult fantasy book, and pretty much it is a loosely based Anthony and Cleopatra retelling. It takes place in this fictional town called Talon, and every year there are these sort of deadly games that citizens can play. It's very much like Hunger Games, kind of battle royale thing, but within the city itself. So like, if you're a random citizen in the city, you could just be walking around one day and then all of a sudden, like, bloodshed is happening. It's, yeah, this very low tech city. And also, one thing about this city is that, like, the way, like, life is lived is very different, because there's this fantasy aspect in this book where people have the ability to jump bodies. So pretty much they themselves, their physical bodies are very much disposable. This body jumping thing, it sounds really complicated, but like once you start reading it, you can kind of grasp like what happens and all that. I'm gonna wait till the second book and see how I feel about it. But for the first book, I really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was fine. I know there's some mixed reviews on it, but overall, I had a great time reading this one. The next recommendation I have is her young adult series, and that is the Secret Shanghai series. So there are currently 4 novels in this series, plus two novellas. The first two books that are more so of a duology are the Violent Delight series. So there's these Violent Delights and then there's Our Violent Ends. And this is the Romeo and Juliet retelling in 1920s Shanghai. And there's a monster running loose in the city. So personally for me, when I read it the first time, I couldn't really get into it, but when I reread it, when I read it the second time, I had the funnest time of my life. I genuinely love this series so much. It is one of my favorite series of all time. I think the romance definitely is what carries this rather than the fantasy. This is again is more romantasy. So, but the romance, the tension, it's so good. So these are the first two books you should read. And then there are the next two books. So there's Foul Lady Fortune and then there's Valhard Huntsman. And these are the next two books of the series. This is more so of a spin-off series, so it's like you don't have to read the first two books in order to read these two, but you will be spoiled about a lot of things. This is a Much Ado About Nothing retelling. It's from the point of views of another character from the first two books, so highly recommend you read these Violent Delights and Our Violent Ends before you get onto these two. The next thing we have are the two novellas. The two novellas that come in between Foul Lady Fortune and Valhard Huntsman. I really can't tell you anything about these novellas without there being spoilers, so just read this in between Foul Lady Fortune and Valhard Huntsman and you should be good to go. Now we are moving on to romance. And this author is one of the authors that like literally got me back into reading, and that is Miss Jenny Han. The first recommendation I have is the To All the Boys I've Loved Before series. I have the special edition of it. This is my favorite series of all time. Like, I literally just said that about the Secret Shanghai series, but for romance, this is my favorite series. Don't ask me how I feel about the movie adaptations of them, but this is my favorite series of all time. It's just, Lara Jean is literally me. I'm Lara Jean. I don't know if I have to actually like give you the synopsis of this book series because I feel like most of us sort of know what To All the Boys I've Loved Before is about, but anyways, the series is about this girl named Lara Jean, and pretty much she writes love letters to all of her crushes, specifically after she gets over a crush. And so she writes love letters to all of her old crushes and all that, and somehow her letters get sent out, and pretty much she has to navigate that mess of, you know, all of her ex crushes coming up to her and being sort of like, what is this, you know? And there's this one character named Peter Kavinsky, the main love interest, and it's just like it makes like this whole series makes me kick my feet, and sometimes that's all you need in a book series. So yeah, for romance, this is what I have. And then the next book series that Jenny Han has written that is not The Summer I Turned Pretty, because I feel like most people can tell you that is her weakest book. Her weakest book is The Summer I Turned Pretty, okay? I will say that with my whole chest. If you like those books, that's fine. But for me, could not catch me. Could not catch me reading those books. But anyways, the next series that Jenny Han has is actually the Burn for Burn series. So there's it is a trilogy, and pretty much it is pretty much about these three girls who plan to do each other's revenge, and it's a fun read. And if you want to read these books, go ahead, do so. But if you don't, I did a whole recap series about these books, so feel free to check it out on my channel. I pretty much tell you the entire plots of all of these books. So yeah, that sort of concludes the series that I recommend for people. Now let's move on to standalone novels. These next two books aren't technically standalones. These are more fantasy books. They are either duologies or they're gonna have their own series and all that. It's just I've only read the first book, so I just categorize them as standalones for some reason. But the first book I have is The Scarlet Alchemist by Kylie Lee Baker. And this one, I believe, came out within the past year or so. And pretty much it's about this girl who is living in this village in China, I believe. And she has dreams of becoming a royal alchemist in order for her to take care of her family and all of that. But one thing about Zealand is that she has the ability to resurrect people from the dead, which is an illegal form of alchemy. This whole sort of book is pretty much about Zealand, and she goes on this adventure with her two siblings in order for her to become this royal alchemist and all of that. It is very interesting, and I can't say too much about it without spoiling it. I believe there's going to be another book, just I don't know if it's been announced yet or anything, but yeah, that is The Scarlet Alchemist by Kylie Lee Baker. The next book I have is The Only a Monster by Vanessa Len. And this, I believe, is either a duology or trilogy, but I haven't read the second book. I've only read the first book. And pretty much this is about this girl named Joan. And pretty much she comes from this mixed family. She's living in London for the summer or whatever. And she pretty much learns that her family are monsters, or she's always grown up hearing that her family are monsters, but she never really knew what that meant. And pretty much what classifies a monster in this book is that pretty much monsters are people who have abilities to time travel. And the way that they time travel is that they can time travel by touching a person and taking sort of however much of their life they choose to. So, say they want to travel back like 20 minutes, they can touch a person, but when they touch that person, they're taking 20 minutes off of this person's life, type of thing. Pretty much, a situation happens where Joan has to go back in time in order to save her family and all of that. And meanwhile, she's doing this, there's also a monster hunter trying to catch her. There's a lot of different things happening in this book, but it's a very interesting read, and I highly recommend. Now let's move on to sort of the young adult coming of age standalone novels. So the first book I have is called Parachutes, and this is by the author Kelly Yang. It's dual point of view, and it's told from the perspectives of this girl named Claire and this girl named Danny. So pretty much Claire, she's from Shanghai, and pretty much her parents make her move to California. Claire is living with Danny and her mom and renting like a bedroom at their house or whatever, and pretty much it's a coming of age story between these two girls, and they don't really get along with each other because they come from such different worlds. And however, things start happening that ultimately their paths have to cross, and they have to sort of work together to sort of figure out their situations. I would definitely check the trigger warnings for this book before you get started with it, even though this is young adult. There are some, themes that some of you guys might not be comfortable with. The next book I have is The Queens of New York by E.L. Shen. And pretty much this book is told from the perspectives of these three girls, this group of three friends, and each one of them are sort of doing their own things for the summer before they go off to college. All of them live in New York and all of that. So one of them, I believe, is like doing this musical theater Broadway summer camp thing. Another one is working at her family's Chinese restaurant in Queens, and then the other girl goes to South Korea for the summer and is trying to figure out sort of what happened to her sister that ultimately ended up passing away there. What I really liked about this book is that I liked how the situations that each of these characters go through are dealt with and all of that, and it doesn't come off as like super like young adult miscommunication tropey or anything. Like, it's very grounded and realistic. The next books I have are, of course, Anne Leung. Anne Leung's is definitely more like coming of age and romance. So if you could see the sun, I would say it is more coming of age. And pretty much it's about this girl named Alice Sun who pretty much ends up getting this ability to turn invisible and pretty much she does this, and with the help of one of her classmates, she ends up doing a lot of these tasks that her classmates ask her to do in exchange for money and all of that. So it's very interesting, and I did film a video about all of the Anne Leung books that I've read and all of that. I believe it's an Asian American girly reads Asian American girly romances. So if you want a more in-depth review of this book, go watch that video as well as some other recommendations. Now let's move on to the romance kind of category. So here's some fun standalone novels. So the first one I have is How to End a Love Story by Yulin Kuang. This is adult romance, so if you are under the age of 18, do not pick this up. It just came out within the past like month or so. It's about this author named Helen Zhang, and one of her books has been chosen to be adapted into an adaptation. So Helen moves to LA, and pretty much she learns that one of the screenwriters for her show is actually a former classmate of hers. They went to the same high school as each other, and she thinks that Grant is the reason for why her sister died and all that. So it's a really, like, the premise itself is kind of just like, whoa, like you're kind of taken aback by it. But this is definitely an interesting romance book to read. I did do a reading vlog on it, so if you want to hear more, go check out that vlog. The next book I have is If I Have to Be Haunted. So this one I read like during Halloween because it was spooky season, but pretty much it's about this girl who has the ability to talk to ghosts. One of her classmates, who happens to be sort of her enemy, her nemesis at her high school. He ends up dying, and they have to work together to figure out sort of what happened to him and how they can bring him back to life. So it's a fun read. This is by Miranda Sun, and there's a romance subplot to it. So if you're looking for a fantasy romantasy type romance book that's young adult, this I highly recommend. The next one I have is a bit more coming of age plus romance and all that, and that is You Reach Sam by Dustin Taub. And this one is pretty much about this girl named Julie, who's a high school student, and her boyfriend Sam ends up passing away and all that. A lot of these books I'm reading are really sad. I just realized that. A lot of these recommendations I'm reading, it's like, oh yeah, someone's orphaned, someone's passed away. I'm so sorry. It's about her boyfriend who passed away, and she is dealing with the grief of all of that, and she doesn't really know how to deal with her grief. And so one day she decides to call his number, and he picks up, and she's kind of, what is happening? Like, you should be dead. And he's like, I technically am, but she can still kind of have this conversation with him. And yeah, so this one is more so about like coming of age, dealing with the grief of a loved one and all that. To give you more of a lighthearted romance recommendation, I would recommend A Taste for Love by Jennifer Yen. So pretty much this book is about this girl named Liza Yang. She lives in Texas, and her mom and dad own this joint like bakery Chinese restaurant situation, and pretty much her mom doesn't like how Liza is sort of living her life and all of that. So, in order to sort of shake things up in Eliza's life, her mom decides to host this baking contest, which actually turns into sort of this matchmaking situation between Eliza and, all the contestants at this contest. So it's very much the Bachelor Bachelorette situation mixed with the Great British Bake Off, and it's a very fun read. It's a very goofy read and all that. Personally, I love this book because Liza is literally me. Like, she is me minus me having a baker mom who sets me up with guys. It's like, other than that, like, I'm literally Eliza. There's this spin-off book called Love Decoded, and pretty much it's about the sister of one of the characters that shows up in this book. And so after you read this book, you can go read Love Decoded. So that is my romance recommendation. Then finally, we move on to what I'm probably most notable on this channel for, my K-pop romance recommendations. I have done a whole video on K-pop romance videos, and I also have a K-drama inspired romance video coming your way. If you want more K-pop romances, K-drama romance videos, go check out my other videos on the channel. But one of my favorite ones is called Somewhere Only We Know by Marine Gu. And pretty much it's about this K-pop star named Lucky who is in Hong Kong for her tour and all of that. She ends up meeting this guy named Jack, and pretty much for a whole like night or whatever, they pretty much decide to let loose and go to town and all of that and do all of these things that Lucky can't do while she's being like a super popular international K-pop star and all of that. So it's kind of like a Ferris Bueller's Day Off situation. And so yeah, it's a really fun read and I highly recommend this. And if you want more K-pop, K-drama inspired romances, go check out my other videos because you'll find tons more in my thoughts about each one of them. So yeah, these are the Asian reading recommendations I have so far. Obviously, I've probably read a lot more and all of that, and I've done reviews on a lot more in my other videos, so if you want to check out some more reading recommendations, go check out my other videos to add some of these books to your TBR. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!